All right, it looks like we have everybody entered. So again, good morning and thank you so much for joining us for today's session titled Effective Legislative Advocacy, a Case Study. Our presenters today are the dLCV Executive Director, Colleen Miller, and Community Brain Injury Services Executive Director, Jason Young. Before we get started, there are a few housekeeping rules we would like to address. Speakers, please remember that we are using live captioning and interpreting services. When you first introduce yourself today, whether it's as a speaker or as a participant later on in the discussion, please include a physical description of yourself and your preferred pronouns. For example, I am an African-American woman with light blonde locks in my hair. I'm wearing glasses. I'm wearing a yellow sweater. And then I have a light blue background with framed certificates and pictures on the wall behind me. My preferred pronouns are she, her. This will help provide context for attendees who may be blind or vision impaired, and will also help our interpreters and captioners locate who's speaking on the screen. Please stay muted at all times unless you are the speaker, and please hold all questions until the end. We do have the chat box that will be monitored by myself, and the chat box is used to ask questions or as directed by the session speaker. At the end of each session, moderators will select some questions from the chat box that you have entered. If your question is chosen, you may take yourself off mute and ask your question, or simply type it in the question box. All right, so that is the end of our directions, and I will turn it over to our presenters, Colleen and Jason.
Thanks so much, Sephora. Hi, everybody. I am Colleen Miller, Director of the Disability Law Center of Virginia. I'm told I can no longer say that I have brown hair, so let's say that I have gray hair, and I'm wearing a black blazer and a red shirt. Most people use the she, her pronouns with me, but if you happen to get it wrong, I never have my feelings hurt. We're joined this morning also with Jason Young, who is the Executive Director of Community Brain Injury Services, and he's going to talk in the next slide, so I'll let him do the little description when we get to that. But let me tell you, first of all, we're in the session, the track of courses this morning that talks about systemic change. And one of the really powerful tools to promote systemic advocacy is seeking legislative change. But it can be tricky, and there can be a lot of ways in which you can just simply mess it up, and sometimes you can make things even worse. So Jason and I are really happy to talk to you today about an experience that we had a year and a half ago with our efforts to get targeted case management for people with traumatic brain injury. We learned a lot of lessons in that process, and we think some of those lessons might be helpful to any of you who are trying to pursue legislative advocacy in the future. So let's go ahead and hear about the origin story. Jason, tell us about it.
Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Jason Young. I'm Executive Director of Community Brain Injury Services. I'm a Caucasian male. I have on glasses today. They are reading glasses, though. Short, kind of dirty blonde hair. I think it's more brown now. And I have a blue collared shirt on and a very Spartan kind of gray background as I'm sitting in my office this morning. So just a little bit about me. I'm Executive Director of Community Brain Injury Services. Our organization is one of the 8 state-funded safety net providers here in Virginia for brain injury services. We cover a 25 locality area that encompasses all of Metro Richmond down through the Virginia Peninsula, which is Hampton, Newport News, Williamsburg area. And we just picked up 7 new localities, some on the Middle Peninsula, and then Dinwiddie, Prince George, and Surrey County to the south of us. And we provide case management as well as our 2 clubhouse programs for adult survivors of brain injury. When Colleen asked me to do this, I was super excited. While I'm executive director of this agency and I do many things throughout the year, the thing that I have probably the most passion about is advocacy. I love talking with legislators. I love going down to the General Assembly. I love, being one of the primary persons that's helping increase access and funding for services for persons with brain injury here in Virginia. And so I'm really excited to share a little bit of, some tips and strategies I've been doing, doing legislative advocacy for 20 plus years now here in Virginia. I'm a registered lobbyist in the Commonwealth of Virginia. It's just something I really enjoy. So I want to talk a little bit, just kind of how this got started, right? How we got started with targeted case management. Well, I know dLCV has had many complaints about the lack of services for brain injury. And as a provider, we've seen that on our end as well. There are areas of Virginia that still do not have a dedicated provider for those areas. Some of our more rural areas in particular do not have dedicated brain injury, safety net brain injury services. And even with the services that we're able to offer with the funding that is given to brain injury, it's a very small menu of services in comparison to what some other disability populations have access to that are funded under different funding sources, mainly kind of Medicaid funding sources. So when we first kind of started to get together and talk about this, we talked about, Medicaid is really a driver in terms of bringing providers and bringing services into a community. And kind of the gold standard, and when you're getting Medicaid services, is to get and ask for a Medicaid waiver. A Medicaid waiver, very quickly, because this is not what we asked for, is a subset of Medicaid services. It allows Medicaid to essentially waive the requirement for institutionalization so that folks can be served with an array of services in the community. Medicaid waivers must be cross neutral. And the great thing about Medicaid waivers, one of the great things about Medicaid waivers, is that for every dollar the state puts in for a Medicaid waiver, the federal government through Medicaid is matching it dollar for dollar. So there's some incentive, right, for the state to continue to fund Medicaid waivers and Medicaid services, because they're drawing in more money to Virginia from the federal government. But go ahead, Colleen.
Yeah. I mean, when Jason and I were preparing for this, we said, let's start at the beginning. Let's talk about the origin story. And we weren't really sure what the origin story was here. I know that dLCV for years has been asked to support creation of a waiver for people with traumatic brain injury. And we had some doubts about whether that was the right approach. We've worked with the state Medicaid agency to try to promote smaller waivers in the past. And if there aren't providers out there who are willing to go through all the extra hassle of being a Medicaid waiver provider, it's going to fail. So we were kind of pushing back a little bit on the request to help create a waiver program because we wanted to create something that was going to succeed.
And that's kind of how targeted case management came about. Instead of, and there was some very political realities that we've been asking for a Medicaid waiver and it hasn't been funded. Because they cost a lot of money, even though you're getting that federal drawdown. And we have other Medicaid waiver systems in Virginia that the state still has some massive waiting lists to it. And so from a legislative perspective, starting another Medicaid waiver for another disability population, that is a large disability population. There are about 300,000 Virginians living with a disability resulting from a waiver, is kind of impalatable. So Colleen and dLCV kind of brought to the table, what if we just go after kind of one service, and that be targeted case management? It's not a Medicaid waiver. We're just amending, and I don't want to get too technical here, but our state Medicaid plan to add one more service, targeted case management, specifically for individuals with traumatic brain injuries, adults with traumatic brain injuries. So it was a much smaller ask, right? And something that fit our community and the service providers that are out there, and hopefully something that the General Assembly would see as an appropriate step, given some of the lack of access to services that exist in Virginia.
So that was the ultimate plan, but it took us a long time to get there. I think one of the most important steps to think about, it, particularly in our advocacy, is that brainstorming and problem solving that has to happen before you even start to talk to legislators about it. And so for us, for Jason's group, for our group, and for other providers, we started talking to advocacy groups about what they saw as solutions, what they saw as obstacles. We also brought in this case, we brought in the Department of Aging and Rehabilitative Services, because that's the agency really that knows the most about the current services for people with traumatic brain injury. And so they were really, really helpful in helping us to understand the state of the provider network right now, the funding for the provider network right now, and what a possible evolution of that provider network would be. I think we considered the Department of Aging and Rehabilitative Services really to be the expert in this as we got started. But for those of you who are pursuing legislative advocacy, don't skip that step. Make sure that you do have input from the people who know something about the services that are going to be proposed, or the funding, to make sure that you don't get tripped up over details along the way. Really, really critical in this step also is to involve the people who will be impacted by it. So in our case, make sure that we are hearing from people with traumatic brain injury and what their needs are. The Disability Law Center of Virginia is fortunate in that we hear from those people all the time. They are reaching out to us about the lack of services, about the lack of providers in their area. So we feel like we had gotten pretty good input from the people who would be impacted by our efforts. But as you out there are pursuing legislative advocacy, don't skip that step. For us, for the group that was gathered to try to promote this, as Jason said, what we really wanted to do is create something that had a chance of success. And that is often pursuing something less than the ideal. You have to really try to figure out what is going to succeed in the General Assembly. And you have to look at a variety of things like the price tag, the complexity, the timelines. If you're proposing a legislative fix that is really complicated, the General Assembly is likely going to stall that effort until they feel like they understand it better. But we wanted not only to succeed in the General Assembly, but we wanted success in the brain injury community as well. And that's where it really comes down to making sure that you're involving people who are going to be impacted by any kind of legislative change. Was there more you wanted to say on this point, Jason?
No, the only thing I was going to add is just, when we did this collaborative brainstorming, Colleen and dLCV brought us all together, right? We all sat together in a conference room over at dLCV, and it included DARS, our lead state agency for brain injury. It also included the Brain Injury Association of Virginia, our Service Provider Alliance, which I serve as the chair of right now, and our lobbyist that the Brain Injury Association of Virginia employs. All of us kind of sitting around the table. And I think brainstorming is the right word for this, because it was a brainstorming session. dLCV had some ideas, right? But we kind of threw a bunch of spaghetti at the wall, and then we left at the end of several of those meetings with what was sticking there, and that was targeted case management.
That's right. So another thing that we really wanted to stress for you is, as you are pursuing legislative advocacy, not to skip the step of having advance conversations with the state agencies that might have something to do with it. I think a lot of times as advocates, we get pretty fired up. We think we know what the solution is, and we just kind of find ourselves a legislative sponsor and plow forward. And if you skip this step of having a conversation with the state agencies, you're very likely going to run into trouble later on down the line. There may be technical aspects of your proposal that you haven't thought about. There may be competing priorities coming from the administration that are going to impact your proposals. So having some conversations with the state agencies that would implement a change is really important. In our case, we were thinking that the Department of Medical Assistance Services, DMAS, would be the agency that would be the key player in implementing any change that we went forward with. So we talked to them. They told us about some of their experiences with trying to secure services for people with brain injury in the past, the difficulties that they had had with trying to implement a waiver for people with brain injury. They were really kind of pessimistic with us about whether this proposal was going to succeed or not. But they didn't say no. They didn't say they would kill it. You know, I think we felt encouraged enough by those two things that we were able to proceed. And an important thing to keep in mind, though, as you have these conversations with state agencies, is that they cannot take an official position on anything without the approval of the governor, regardless of who the governor is. State agencies can't express support for something, but they can give you technical assistance. And I think the other thing that's really important about communicating with the state agencies is that you don't catch them by surprise. Because if you've come up with a proposal that they had no idea was coming, again, the chances are really strong that they're going to try to slow walk it, that they will try to kill it or postpone it until they can figure out exactly what it is you're trying to accomplish. So we both really want to stress that those conversations with the relevant state agencies, in this case, it was Department of Aging and Rehabilitative Services, and also the Department of Medical Assistance Services, DMAS, that we really felt like we needed to talk to.
And Colleen, you can switch it over to the next slide, but just to elaborate just a little bit upon that is almost anything that you seek to get accomplished through advocacy in the General Assembly is going to be directed to some type of state agency. Any type of money, the General Assembly, years past, used to have a non-state budget line item where you could get in there. They don't do that anymore. So any money that you get is going to go to a state agency, and any legislation that you seek to enact is going to be directed at whatever state agency is in charge of it. So they are going to be impacted. And if you're not communicating with them and you catch them off guard, they're going to do exactly what Colleen says. Hey, we don't know anything about this. We need time. Maybe we can study this next year. So educating them on the front end, hopefully you make them to be allies and friends of yours, but you definitely don't want to make them your enemy. And that's what can happen if you're not communicating with them.
Right.
So we're going to talk about educating champions in the legislature here. And we posted in the chat when we first came in is, do you know who your legislator is? Okay. And my first kind of message here is, when you're trying to find a champion to put forth legislation or a budget amendment for you, where do you start? Okay. And where I suggest you start is with your own legislators, your own delegate and your own state senator. If you don't know who that is, that website right there, who'smy.virginiageneralassembly.gov, you can go to that, pop your address in, and it will tell you who your legislators are, both on a state level and a congressional level. So that's a quick and easy way to start. The other website, which is the next one, Colleen, pop that up, virginiageneralassembly.gov. This is the General Assembly website. It is an excellent tool. It is filled with so much information about each legislature, the budget, all the details about session and how things work. But I want to point out, if you go on, you can pull up, every legislator has a page, right? You can find out their contact information, how to email, how to call them, both in session and out of session, who their legislative aide is. I'm going to talk about legislative aides and how important they are in a second, what committees they serve on, what past legislation they've patroned and championed, and other appointments that they have in other committees and around the Commonwealth. So you can get a really good sense right there as to what their passions are by looking at what committees they serve on, what legislation they've championed in the past, and what other agencies and appointments they serve on. It's a wealth of information to find out who might have an interest in the area that you're going to talk to them about. So when you start to look at champions, okay, you want to select very carefully. And my recommendation, if you don't have a champion already, is that you look at who are some of the new folks to the General Assembly, okay? Your folks that are senior, the folks that have a lot of power at the General Assembly are folks that have been there for a while, okay? And so you can try to make friends with them, but they already have lots of friends. They already have lots of causes that they're champion already, okay? I wouldn't say it's not a bad idea to contact them, but oftentimes, starting with a new legislator that maybe doesn't have a lot of issues that they're championing right now and doesn't have a lot of people coming to them because they don't have a lot of power, is a good way to start. And why that is because this cultivation process of educating legislators is not something that's done in a matter of months. This is a process that takes years, okay? And so while you're cultivating them over this multi-year process, those legislators, if you're choosing well, are moving up in seniority, okay? And so then they are becoming the more senior legislatures. I'm going to give you an example from about 20 years ago of how we cultivated a local legislator here in the Richmond area. And that legislator was Delegate 𝐻𝐿𝐬𝐀𝐧𝐭𝐞𝐫. And we started with Delegate 𝐻𝐿𝐬𝐀𝐧𝐭𝐞𝐫. He's a delegate from he served the Colonial Heights area. He's a school teacher, okay? And we went to meet with him about 20 years ago at his office. And he was, I don't know when 𝐻𝐿𝐬𝐀𝐧𝐭𝐞𝐫 came into office, but he was a relative newbie at the time. He didn't have a lot of power. And we took some constituents of his that had a brain injury, some of their family members, and we just talked with them about their experiences and kind of, just had a nice conversation with them. And through that process, he gradually became an ally. And after that, we went and met with him every single year after that, okay? And sometimes I didn't have to take persons impacted because now I've already have a relationship with Delegate 𝐻𝐿𝐬𝐀𝐧𝐭𝐞𝐫. So as the years went along, Delegate 𝐻𝐿𝐬𝐀𝐧𝐭𝐞𝐫 moved up in seniority. He got himself on House Appropriations, the House Money Committee. A couple of years later, he became chair of House Appropriations. 𝐻𝐿𝐬𝐀𝐧𝐭𝐞𝐫 ended his tenure a couple years ago as Speaker of the House of Delegates. Okay, so this is a man that has immense power. He's one of the top 2 or 3 elected officials in Virginia as Speaker of the House. Had we tried to go and meet with him when he was Speaker of the House without having built that bridge in years past, we would, first of all, we wouldn't have gotten to meet with him as Speaker of the House, right? Because we don't have a prior connection. But that's that's a good example of how you can kind of build a champion by starting with folks that are new legislators and growing with them as they grow as legislators in the General Assembly process.
Yeah, and if I could, Jason, just to state the obvious here, but sometimes you don't think about it. The champions for disability rights that exist in the legislature right now all started out as newbies at some point. They were not born with the experience and the years of service that they have right now. The patron of our bill to create targeted case management was Patrick Hope. And dLCV has been working with Delegate Hope since he joined the legislature 12 years ago, I think it was. And he's now one of the senior members of the legislature. When our bill got into appropriations, we worked closely with Delegate Mark Sickles, but we've worked with Delegate Sickles over the years on a number of different issues. And so we didn't have to introduce ourselves to him and explain what our legitimacy is in the world, because he knew us already, and Delegate Hope knew us already, and because we'd been working with these legislators since their early days.
And by knowing Colleen, they had trust, right? They had trust in what Colleen was coming to them with, because she's built a relationship with them. And honestly, this comes down to transactional relationships in a lot of situations. Getting legislators to know you, to trust you and what you're saying to them, trust that you're going to, if you're going to ask them to introduce something for you, that when you ask and a legislator agrees to introduce legislation, that you guys are partners now. You are partners in getting that legislation through the General Assembly. And your work is not done when you get a patron for it. And you have to then work as a partner with that legislator to get that budget amendment or bill, whatever it might be, passed through there. So that's part of kind of building these champions and building relationships with folks. Colleen, I think you can go to the next one.
Are you all able to hear Colleen right now?
No, I couldn't.
Oh,
hear
sorry
Colleen.
about that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I've got work trucks in the background here, so I've been going on mute when I'm not speaking. Sorry about that. Anyway, yeah. As far as in the do your research category here, it really helps if you can identify people who may have a personal connection to your advocacy cause. Sometimes you have to uneducate them, because sometimes they think that their experience with the service community is the only experience. But for the most part, if they have a personal connection with the cause, with the issues, they're going to be really good champions for you. And then it also helps to just identify people who are on the committees that may be considering your legislation. A lot of our legislation goes to health, welfare, and institutions. It can go to the Committee on Education. And so it's good to know the people who are on those committees, because they too can guide you on what is likely to be heard in the committee and what is not. And then finally, the point that Jason made is that this takes years. So you may have a conversation with a new delegate right now and think that this has been a complete waste of time. You're not getting anything out of it. You really have to be prepared to commit for the long run here if you're going to be effective in your advocacy.
So I want to talk a little bit about what happens during session. Okay. And the first thing I want to acknowledge, if you've been to the General Assembly or if you haven't, is it is a very hectic place. Okay. It is, if you are easily overwhelmed with outside external stimuli, the General Assembly is going to be an overwhelming place for you. There's a lot going on. There's people moving fast. It is crowded. It can be very intimidating. And further, it can be very intimidating to meet with legislators. And there's always two things I like to keep in mind whenever time I go to meet with a legislator. Number one is I'm the subject matter expert on what the issue I am going to talk to them about. I'm the subject matter expert on brain injury. That has some responsibility upon myself, right? That I need to know and understand what I'm talking about. But I go in there knowing that I know more than that legislator about the issue that I'm going to talk about. And so that gives me some confidence going in. The other thing that I always remind myself is that legislators are public servants, okay? They are elected to serve the public, okay? So it is their job to listen to people, to listen to ideas, to meet with people. So don't ever think that if you're requesting a meeting with a legislator during outside of session, during session, that you are imposing upon their very valuable time. You are not. That is their job. Okay. They put their pants on one leg at a time, just as you do. They are people just like us. And so that is always something I keep in mind, because again, the session can be very intimidating, and just meeting with a legislator can be very intimidating, but they are just like us. So when you go to session, first of all, your work in developing a champion and meeting with folks needs to be done outside of session. You cannot wait to session to introduce legislation. If you do, it is too late, okay? There are deadlines for bills and budget amendments. They are usually right in the first couple days of session to have them filed. And your work in educating your champions is done before session. It's done in the summer, it's done in the fall. It's not done at the General Assembly. What you want to do at the General Assembly is, if you have legislation that you've been able to introduce or that you want to support, is to go down and to educate the other 140 potential voters on that in the House of Delegates and the Senate. First of all, just, basic kind of getting into the General Assembly. It's downtown. The new General Assembly building, I haven't been in there yet. It's going to open, I think, next month. But what I can tell you about the old General Assembly building and the one that they've been using interim is they're downtown. You got to park several blocks. I park 5 or 6 blocks away. It's winter. It's cold when you're walking there. When you go to get in the building, again, it's very crowded. You have to go through security. So you're going to have to wait in a line many times to get in. So factor that all in when you get there. Arrive way earlier than you think you need to have to, because you got to account for parking, walking, security, and then you got to account for the elevators in the building, which is the other thing. The elevators in the building are packed. If you have the ability to use the steps, that's something that that is always a good tip as well. A lot of legislators use the stairs because the elevators are so crowded. So when you go to meet with legislators, you can set up appointments with them ahead of time to try to get an appointment time with them. That appointment does not guarantee that you're going to meet with the legislators. Okay, legislators do not know their schedules, literally until the day of the schedule, and they might have a schedule that day that gets interrupted because they have a committee meeting that comes up suddenly. Legislators are extremely busy during session. You're more than likely not to meet with a legislator during session. You're more than likely to meet with their aides. And those are folks that you want to become very good friends with. And because those are the folks that you're going to be doing most of your conversations with during session, okay? When you go to talk with an aide or a legislator, you need to have your elevator speech ready, okay? Out of session, you might get to meet with a legislator for an hour, 30 minutes, 45 minutes, an hour. You might have a lot of time. You do not have that time during session. When I go in to meet with an aide or a legislator, I have my elevator speech down, and that speech is going to be no more than 2 minutes, okay? Because oftentimes that's all you have. You might get a couple more minutes of, question and answer back and forth with them, or you might just get that 2 minutes with them and then you're out the door. So having that ready, prepared to go, having your talking points is the other thing that you need to have as well. Those are kind of your one pager. It shouldn't be more than one page. Don't bring a whole booklet of information down there to share with a legislator. Pamphlets, I don't find them helpful as well, because legislators are being bombarded and aides are being bombarded with paperwork. So make it short, make it simple, make it something easily digestible that they can look at and understand very quickly. Colleen, I think you can skip a few down here because I've kind of.
Yeah, and I just want to make sure that well, let me see if I can advance that. There we go.
Yeah.
One little tip for you is to distinguish between the secretary who works for the legislator and the legislative aide. The secretary comes from a secretarial pool. They don't know anything about the issues. They very intentionally are not allowed to comment on the issues or on the legislator's position. They are allowed to take phone messages. That's it. If you have something really substantive that you want to communicate, you should communicate by email to the legislative aide and then try to get a meeting with the legislative aide. So just make sure that you know the difference between the secretary and the legislative aide. The secretary usually doesn't even make the schedule for the legislator. So we also wanted to include a couple of other things here, some of which may not be obvious, but especially if you're promoting something that has a price tag with it, it's good to try to get some of that information to the finance committee staff, the appropriations committee staff. You can usually find their email addresses on the General Assembly website. It's much more difficult unless you've, again, established relationships with them. It's more difficult to get meetings, especially during the session. They are pretty much out of their minds during the session. But the courtesy of sending them that one-page flyer or short description or something like that can sometimes help. The process after a bill is introduced is that it's assigned to a committee and the committee holds a hearing on it. For that, you need to prepare talking points for your legislator to be able to talk about the bill. Oftentimes, as Jason said, you are the expert in the room. And so the legislator may just simply do a quick summary of it and then ask to turn the podium over to you. So you need to be prepared for that too. We've got a lot of things that we want to talk about the budget. So let's just kind of zip through these next few points a little bit. The grassroots advocacy can be very important during the session, especially if something's going badly. If there's a bill that's been introduced and has been amended so that it's no longer where you want it to head. Sometimes reaching out to your constituents and say, everybody flood Senator so-and-so with emails right now and ask them not to pursue this amendment. So grassroots advocacy can help. And we also, as far as tips, keep in mind when the halfway point is. Crossover is roughly halfway through, and that means that a bill that started in one of the House has to get all the way through the House, has to be approved by either the House or the Senate so that it can switch over to the other side. Usually about a week after crossover is the deadline for each House to develop their bills on the budget. So those deadlines can be really important. If you are seeking an amendment to the budget, to the governor's proposed budget, the deadline to get that filed is usually within the first couple of days of the session. So that is also something that just can't wait till the last minute for you to work on. So once the budget has come out of the House or the Senate, once the bills come out of the House and the Senate, you kind of start all over again and have to work the other side of the General Assembly in order to make sure that it gets through the next phase there. And then this is the hard lesson to take away from it, is that a lot of this goes on behind closed doors. If the bill comes out of one House in a slightly different fashion than the other House, the bill will be assigned to a conference committee to resolve the differences, and you are not in the room when that happens. There are a lot of decisions that are made on bills in the party caucuses, and you are not in the room when those decisions are made. So it's really it's hard sometimes to accept that now it's out of your hands. We did want to talk a little bit about the difference between a budget amendment and a bill. And Jason, why don't you go ahead and get us started on that?
Yeah, so first of all, there's two things that are happening in the General Assembly. There's new legislation that is passed via bills, and of course, there is a budget that is going to be passed as well. And they are two processes that are operating at the same time, but they are two completely different processes that are occurring. I am most familiar with the budget amendment process because every single year we're introducing legislation to amend the budget to add more money for brain injury services. And it might be specific in terms of what we are asking for. But a couple things you need to know about the budget amendments process is first of all, unlike the bill process where you have hearings, and a bill is heard in a subcommittee, it's heard in a full committee. There is a public vote that is taken and recorded on every single bill, whether it passes or it doesn't pass, and every legislator is on record as to whether they voted for it or against it. The budget amendment process is completely different, okay? Budget amendments are decided behind closed doors, okay? There is a hearing for the budget amendments, but that's literally just for the legislators to hear what the budget amendment is about. They are not discussing nor voting upon it, and then typically there's not even conversation about it during these hearings. So that's just something that you need to know and understand. The other thing I think it's important to know whether you have a budget amendment or a bill is you need to know what committee it's going to go before. And my job every single year, talk about a budget amendment, is to speak to every single person that's on that committee to educate them prior to the deadline when they're going to make the decision on that about why I think they need to support what we are asking. So that kind of narrows your scope a lot. Okay, so there's 140 legislators at the Virginia General Assembly. You do not need to talk to all 140 of those. That would be overwhelming and crazy. You need to talk to probably 7 to 10 that are going to be on your committee making that decision. Okay, so that narrows it down greatly. So knowing those folks, I come down with a spreadsheet every year of the folks that are on my committees, what offices they're in, who their legislative aides are, and I can just make a check mark when I've gone through and talked with all of them. Sometimes it takes me several days to do that because, again, the General Assembly is very busy, and folks might not be available one day when I go down, so I have to go down another day to meet with those folks that I can't catch. But that's kind of my process in terms of going through. Colleen, is there anything else that you kind of want to add on kind of the budget amendment or bill process here?
Well, just as we mentioned that the budget amendment has a very, very early filing deadline. And so you have to be mindful of that. It can help if your patron on your substantive legislation is actually on the House Appropriations Committee or the Senate Finance Committee, but those are honestly your most popular people in the legislature. So it can be challenging to get them to be your patron. And as Jason said, many of the budget amendments are decided without a hearing or just with a couple of minutes that are said about each thing. And a lot of the budget decisions, almost all of the budget decisions, are made behind closed doors. So, when you get your budget in, you get your amendment in, it gets adopted by both sides, it's in the budget, you have your substantive legislation that's approved by both the House and the Senate. It's time to do your happy dance. No, not yet. You're not done yet. It's important to remember that for all of those things, the legislation, the budget amendments, they all have to be approved by the governor. So if you have some reason to think that you might get some resistance from state agencies who advise the governor, or some resistance from the governor, him or herself, you really need to start working that side of the equation as well. We also have to have the governor sign the budget, And there's a lot of decisions that are made in the budget that actually don't have much to do with money. It's what they call language amendments. And sometimes there are amendments in the budget that direct an agency to do something and there's no money attached to it. Those are things that, again, the governor is going to need to approve. And as we know, in recent years, the session ends often without a budget. I think this year was shocking how late the budget was actually approved. It was not approved until September, but the budget typically takes effect on July 1st, except for, when it isn't passed by then. And then after July 1st, really, in a lot of ways, your work starts with a whole new focus. If you have some legislation that requires action from a state agency, then you have to start working with that state agency to implement it. Sometimes it's a study bill that the state agency doesn't really want to do. So it's great advocacy on your part if you can do some of the groundwork for the state agency first, let them know some of the research you've already done. In the case of the targeted case management, which Jason and I are talking about here, it required the state to amend the state Medicaid plan, and the Department of Medical Assistance Services put together a working group to advise them on the amendment to the state Medicaid plan. They also, at the same time, used that working group to figure out what they would do with a brain injury waiver. And that got to be very confusing for people because one thing was an amendment to state plan, the other was a possible waiver to pursue. And it really required people to kind of keep a dual focus as they went forward. So this is all just to say that legislative change is really powerful. It is a long-lasting solution, but it is so slow. Jason, you want to talk a little bit about the process here?
I know we're kind of running up against it. I know we won't have time for questions, but yeah, so we passed this legislation, the General Assembly passed this legislation July 1st, 2022. Okay, so we're sitting here, it's what, September 21st, 2023 now. So, 14, 15 months after we passed it, and targeted case management still is not a thing. Okay, it is not operational yet. Okay, and that just speaks to this process of how long it takes when you're really making a big, and this is a big policy change and a big service change, is that there's so many regulations that need to be worked on. Providers like us need to become Medicaid providers. We need to figure out and be educated on how to do that. The state Medicaid managed care organizations need to understand this new service and how they're going to credential it. And as Colleen said, there are public comment periods that need to happen. There are work groups that need to happen to get regulations. It just takes a long time. So even though we're all cheering when we got it passed last year, that was really the beginning of our work. And it's an effort that still continues to this day to get targeted case management up and operational and actually serving Virginians with brain injury. We have a go live date of 10/1. I snicker every time I say that because that's like 10 days from now. I can guarantee you, I hope no from DMAS is on here, that no one's going to be served as of 10/1, because again, this is an evolving thing. It just takes it takes longer than anyone would have anticipated it to take, just because there's so many moving parts.
And then sometimes you get through the process and you really need to start over again. So at this point, perhaps your bill has been amended so that it's not going where you want it to do, where you wanted it to go. Perhaps the budget amendment wasn't adopted. And it's important to really kind of step back and do an honest debriefing. Start with the partners where you were brainstorming in the beginning. Bring your patron back into it and get feedback from the patron about where did we run into problems. You have to recognize, however, that your legislative patrons all have real jobs. They are not full-time legislators. And so when the session ends, they're going back to their insurance offices, their law offices, their classrooms, and trying to get caught up with everything that they weren't able to do during the session. So give the patrons a little bit of breathing room before you come back to them. Keep in mind that in the Virginia legislature, there's kind of a legend that the first time out, you're never successful with a new initiative, with a new budget amendment, with a new program. So don't be too discouraged if the first time out you don't succeed. A very common thing that happens in the legislatures, particularly with a new initiative, is that the legislature will convert it into a study bill and will assign a state agency to study the question that you've put before them. Don't be discouraged by that either. Keep in mind that Virginia loves studies, and the legislature may create a study bill for your problem for many, many years in a row. And that can be discouraging because you feel like it's been studied to death, but that is sometimes the best you can hope for. Regulation development, as we're seeing with targeted case management, can take a very, very long time. So you need to stay with that and work with that. And if you weren't successful, try again. A lot of these new initiatives just simply do not succeed on the first try. So don't assume that that is a permanent end to your initiative. And if there's one message that Jason and I have hopefully shared with you throughout this, it is a year-round process. If you start to work on something in January, just figure you're actually working on it for the following legislative session, because it's not going to happen if you haven't done any of the work beforehand. So we've got a few minutes here to hear about your experiences, to see if you have any questions. Zipporah, what's the best way to do that? Should people put the questions in the chat box?
Yes, put them in the chat box. I do have somebody who commented that they joined the session late and they just wanted clarification about whether or not there is a new brain injury waiver. So if you can just briefly, cover or explain what that was about.
Yeah, so what we were pursuing, what the Disability Law Center was pursuing, was not a waiver. We were pursuing a change to the state Medicaid plan to provide targeted case management for people with traumatic brain injury. That is the part of it that is supposed to go live on October 1st. And we do not believe it's actually going to happen, but it is on a faster track than a brain injury waiver. At the same time that our initiative was passed, the legislature did also charge the Department of Medical Assistance Services with exploring whether to create a brain injury waiver. That is on a slower track. It takes a much longer time to create that. And our hope is that by having targeted case management available, is that we will start to expand the provider services that are available to people with brain injuries, so that when a waiver does finally happen, there will be providers who are willing to participate in it. Does that make sense? So,
yes, thank you.
Yeah, the short answer is no, there is not a brain injury waiver. I don't believe we've even applied for a brain injury waiver yet. Have we, Jason?
Correct. Yeah. So over the past year, DMAS has, again, in conjunction with targeted case management, had a work group that's also been working on developing a rate structure methodology for a brain injury Medicaid waiver. And they will go back to the General Assembly this year with a price tag for that waiver, which we'll just have to see whether the General Assembly approves whatever kind of dollar figure they attach with it to authorize it. So yes, there is a movement afoot to get a brain injury waiver, Medicaid waiver going here in Virginia. DMAS has been directed to do so, but until the legislature actually funds it, it does not exist.
So the thing that goes live is Medicaid supported case management services. And our hope is that by going that route, that we will help the community of providers already become more comfortable working with Medicaid so that they will consider being waiver providers, and also to expand the base of providers out there so that Medicaid waiver services might be available all over the state. But that is a long ways off. There's a question,
you.
a question about what agency would somebody with brain injury apply to for case management? Jason, do you have any idea how that will work?
So how I think it's going to work is the state-funded provider network right now has kind of been charged with becoming the initial set of service providers for targeted case management. So there are 8 of us. We all operate in different service areas around the state. And so we are going to be the initial providers of that service through the state managed care organizations. What remains to be seen, though, is none of us are accredited yet, which is why it's not gone live yet, are credentialed. And there are some unserved areas of the state that'll be very interesting to see how that's addressed, because there will not be accredited providers to provide that service in those communities. So I hope that kind of answers your question. And I wanted to comment on, I think it was, I'm gonna pull up the chat now, Carolyn, who talked about party a little bit down there. And this has been my experience from doing this for 20 plus years at the General Assembly. To me, party does not matter at the General Assembly. Republican, Democrat, it does not matter. When you're talking about disability issues, that is generally a nonpartisan issue, okay? And I also say you need friends on both sides of the aisle as well. Okay, so you want friends on the Republican side and friends on the Democratic side as well. So I don't really look at party when I go down there. And the other thing I don't do when I'm talking about my issues is talk about other issues. You know, so I'm not going to go down and talk about what my personal opinions are on abortion or gun rights when I'm talking about my brain injury legislation. Okay, because nothing's going to turn a legislator off is if you start talking about something that they vehemently disagree with. Talk about your issue when you go to talk with them, and talk about solely your issues.
So Jason, Carolyn's observation, I think, was that members of the minority party may have more time to talk to you because they have fewer committee assignments, they have fewer leadership responsibilities. And I think that that is true when you're thinking about cultivating those relationships. If there's, somebody that you think years down the line would be a good patron, I think that is an important thing to keep in mind is who has time to talk to you. Yeah. But Jason's exactly right. Disability does not really have one party or the other that is better for it. Some of our greatest patrons have been from both parties. So I think we're about out of time.
Yeah,
Zipporah, do you get to do the closing comments?
Yeah, I was just going to say we have a couple of thank yous and that this was a very informative and great presentation. So thank you both for your expertise and your time. And that concludes this presentation. And on the screen here, you can see both Colleen and Jason's contact information if you would like more information or if you think of additional questions after this session.
Thanks, everybody, for joining us.
Thank you so much as well.
We will sign off.